And we're live with JavaScript Air. Hello everyone, my name is Kent C. Dodds, and I am your host today for this JavaScript Air episode number 20, which means it's our 21st episode because we started 0 here. But we're going to be talking about Ember today. Before we get into that and introducing our guests, I'd like to give a shout out to the sponsors that make the money parts of this podcast possible, the money parts being like transcripts and hosting and the newsletter and stuff like that. So thanks to our sponsors. Our first sponsor, our premier sponsor, is Egghead.io, and they have a huge library of bite-sized web development training videos. Check them out for content on JavaScript, Angular, React, Node, and hopefully Ember sometime. I'm looking at you, honey. Then Front-End Masters is a recorded, expert-led workshop with courses on advanced JavaScript, asynchronous and functional JS, as well as lots of other great courses on front-end topics. I think they actually do have content on Ember. So yeah, check them out. At frontendmasters.com. And then Track.js. Track.js reports bugs in your JavaScript before customers notice them, and with their telemetry timeline, you'll have the context to actually fix them. Check them out and start tracking JavaScript errors today at trackjs.com. And SparkPost is an email delivery built for developers. Build something awesome with their Node.js library or SMTP relay. Start sending 100,000 emails free with SparkPost at sparkpost.com/jsair. And then WebStorm. WebStorm is a powerful JavaScript IDE. It makes developers more productive with its super intelligent code assistance for JavaScript, Node, Angular, React, and integration with lots of different tools. Learn more at jetbrains.com/WebStorm. Sweet, that's our sponsors. So before we get underway, if you have questions while we're doing this show, if you're watching live, then you can ask those questions of the panelists and our guests using the hashtag JSRQuestion on Twitter, and I watch that during the show and at the end of the show so that we can bring up those questions during the show. And then remember that this is a weekly show, and so we do have another show next week. It will be a different time. I believe it's 2 p.m. MDT or MST, whatever daylight savings we're on right now. But we're going to be on site at ngconf. So yeah, it should be fun. And we'll have a bunch of guests there. It'll be like our other conference on-site shows. Definitely looking for feedback on those. And then, as always, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Google+ to keep up with the latest from JavaScript Air. Great, so let's go ahead and introduce who we have as panelists today. First, for our panelists, we have Ihani Ikekuchu.
Ekachuku. We'll get it.
Echikuku. I'll get it, I promise.
Yeah, no worries.
And Kyle Simpson.
Hello, everyone.
And then for our guest today, we have Gavin Joyce.
Hi.
And Matthew Beal.
Howdy.
And Robert Jackson.
Hello, hello.
And we're super excited to have you all. I'd like to invite each one of you to just introduce yourselves, who you are, why you care about Ember, that kind of thing. So we'll start with Gavin.
Okay, so I live in Dublin, Ireland. I've got 2 young great kids. I've been building software for about 18 years. 2.5 years ago, I joined my present company, Intercom, and I introduced Ember successfully to Intercom. We've grown fantastically since then. We released a number of great products, and I'm very enthusiastic, and I love Ember, the community, and the framework. Sweet.
Let's go with Matthew next.
Yeah, howdy. My name is Matthew Beal. I go by the handle Mixonic on, I don't know, Slack and Twitter, since there's public Slacks now. I'm a developer based in New York City. A few years ago, I started a small consulting company with a partner of mine, Corey Forsyth. We're called 201 Created. We do a lot of open source and helping companies work with open source to create like scalable solutions and scalable communities. So we've done some work on open source text editor called MobileDoc, and we've been working with Ember for like 3.5 or 4 years or something like that. It's amazing how much time has gone by. It's really incredible. Yeah, so that's the 80-20.
Cool, yeah, time flies when you're having fun. Awesome. Robert, why don't you go next?
Yep, I'm Robert Jackson. I am a developer at Twitch at this point, and I work with I work with Mixonic on the core team, the Ember core team, and do just a bunch of open source development in and around the Ember ecosystem on roughly any possible add-on that exists. Just love the community, and it's what keeps me coming back and contributing and getting involved.
Very cool. I didn't realize you worked at Twitch. That's cool. So when I was live streaming, adding you to the JavaScript Air website like 2 hours ago, you're like, oh, cool, Twitch.
Yes, hey, I know that site.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's get into our subject today. We're talking about Ember, and each one of you care a thing or two about Ember. So I think it's good to always start out our conversations with a good baseline so we all understand what we're talking about. Make sure that we all understand we're talking about a washing machine. No, just kidding. A framework. Let's chat about that. So what is Ember?
Well, there is a coffee mug that is made by a company named Ember. Maybe that's it.
That's confusing.
There's also an Embers dance club in Portland, which everyone recognizes when we go to EmberConf every year, and then tweets about it.
Nice.
Yeah, Embers a JavaScript framework that originally was called Sprout Core 2 and then was called Ember. It was really spun off from like a legacy at that time project called Sprout Core. Yehuda Katz and Tom Dale are the ones who famously started working on Ember. Really what their goal was to take some of the parts of Sprout Core, which was heavily inspired by iOS development and Cocoa and that style of library, and try and bridge that with the fact that Sprout Core felt very awkward on the web because you no longer had access to things like HTML and CSS and what you kind of expected from a web framework. So Ember really attempted very early on to marry those two things, to say let's take the things that work really well in Objective-C or any other kind of native development and bring them into the web, but not lose the parts of the web that make it a viable, important platform that's been around for 20-something years. So I don't know. That's the high level summary. Values that Ember has that make it kind of unique, or at least things that we like to tout. Of course, many frameworks have different variations of this, but we strongly take from Rails the idea of convention over configuration. So Ember tries to emphasize that there is a pit of success that you will fall into by doing something, instead of needing to discover or find what the right way is amongst multiple options. There's a question that popped up. I should close this real quick.
That's right. I was just mostly making that as a note to myself, but I wanted to ask you, Matthew, you mentioned that there are some important things that you didn't want to lose in the web platform. What are some of those important things that you were talking about?
Yeah, HTML and the web APIs are they are like the strongest SEM guarantee that you can possibly have, right? They will never break. You can write an app for the web, and there's a pretty deep chance that it will still work on many, many platforms all around the globe in 8 years. We're supporting Microsoft browsers that are nearly 10 years old, and we are actually supporting them. And that's a thing that you couldn't say if you were to write your app for iOS. You're not supporting a 10-year-old version of iOS. So I think that's a really valuable part of the web platform that we want to hold on to. The other thing is still URLs. URLs are still something that native platforms have attempted a couple passes at, but I don't think they've quite knocked out of the park like the web has. The idea that you can take all of the state of the application that you're currently running, put it into a simple text string, which is hopefully human readable, but not always, and then pass it around is still a really valuable concept. Yeah, I feel like maybe I should kick it over to Gavin or Robert if they want to talk, and I'm sure I missed a whole bunch of good intro things.
Okay, so for me, as not someone who works on the internals of Ember, I'm not on any of the teams that, like Robert and Matthew are, but I do build a pretty large application on Ember, so I have that perspective. For me, some of the great things about Ember are one, the conventions, and this isn't just the conventions around thinking about the application that's actually running in terms of the moving parts. There are very strong conventions there, but it extends to the actual structure of the file system, how files are laid out, how we test the app, how we deploy it, how we create it, how we pull parts out into add-ons, how the community coalesces around these add-ons, how we progress the framework by submitting RFCs, how it has a 6-week release cycle, and how it cares about all of the apps that are out there, and thinks thoughtfully about how we can get from a pre-release to a 1 release to a 0.2 to a 0.3, how we actually bring everyone along with that and everyone gets better all at the same time. How we talk to our JSON APIs. All of these things are decisions that a lot of people have to make for themselves, and people make various different decisions. By not having to make those decisions, an app like Intercom and a team of 70 engineers, maybe 30 who regularly work on the Ember app, we're just starting from a much higher place, so we can be extremely productive with the framework.
I have a question. So Ember, I think, would very fairly be categorized in the top 3 of the major frameworks that get most of the attention these days. Certainly not the only ones, but I think top 3: Angular, React, and Ember. Kind of most people would agree with that. So I think a lot of our listeners might be interested to hear you talk, any one of the panelists talk about why would I choose. So I have two-part question. First of all, why would I choose Ember over just writing the code myself? So what are the places where Ember has kind of a sweet spot? You touched a little bit on that with some of the platform level stuff, kind of like the inherited from Rails. But I'd like to know more about that. Like, what are some use cases where Ember really shines? And second part of that question is, what are some of the places where Ember is going to differ in the approach to app development as opposed to something like React or Angular?
I'll jump in. So a couple of things to the first question. Basically, the idea behind Ember is that you can jump in and you can build out an app quickly, and you don't hit walls as you go. You don't have to get to a point where the things you've written before, how you have to tear apart and redo because it doesn't scale. With regards to number of developers, number of like pages or routes or whatever the case may be in the app. I think to do that, we've built a ton of tooling around making it very easy and straightforward to get started in an app. I mean, it's just a handful, like npm install Ember CLI and then Ember new some name. That's it. And I think that's really powerful. It lets you jump in and hit the ground running, and then you don't have to build your own build tooling. You don't have to figure out how to transpile ES6 if you want to use ES6. You don't have to decide where to put your files or how to deploy. All of that stuff is sort of prepackaged and ready to go, which you could absolutely do with any of the or your own homegrown thing. You can absolutely do all of those things straightforwardly. I mean, these are known solutions. The problem is you have to do them. You then are maintaining and required to maintain all of that code and all that whole solution basically forever until it either stops working, you leave, or you have to rewrite it in something else, right? Like, so I think that's one of the real powers of Ember. It's like a community of developers building all the things that we all have to build and create and ship, and and so that each of us individually don't have to build our own bespoke systems separately, and we can all focus on just building the apps that we actually care about.
So on that point, just to drill in a little bit, since it was invoked earlier with Rails, I was never a Rails developer, but I know many that are and have talked a lot. And one of the characteristics that I got about the Rails community was kind of like there's like one right way to do each task. Like there's one Rails module that's kind of everybody uses for authentication, and one that everybody uses for the caching, and one for testing or whatever. Is that similar in the Ember world where it's not a lot of choice? It's kind of like we've already figured out, and so just pull these Legos in, or how do you manage the choice in a big ecosystem?
So the phrasing is slightly odd. Sorry. So there's a few things. Firstly, the most of the things you're talking, like most of the things you're going to want to do, have been solved. The generic things have been solved by add-ons, what we call add-ons, which is just npm packages that know how to plug into certain hooks in Ember CLI. there is a great website, emberobserver.com, that you can go to and get like a ranking, and they evaluate the tests and sort of tell you like categories of, you know, things to update the document title or things to do authentication or like that kind of stuff. Similar things exist probably in every ecosystem, and I probably don't know them all, but it's a great avenue to explore. I think that the idea that there's only one way to do a thing is generally not true, and is generally a thing that puts a lot of people off. I think that there are in a lot of cases is a few really good contenders for how to do specific things, like network requests or you know, API structures or things like that. And the fact that you can just pick the one you like, you know, look at rankings, figure out what people are using, and just, you know, go to town. I think that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about.
Yeah, and to add to that, there is an emerging tradition that started really only in the last year of independent solutions that are independent add-ons, NPM packages solving a similar problem, coming together to take the lessons that they learned and come up with one solution. And what's kind of cool about this is it's been very much a bottom-up thing. So Luke Malia gave a talk at last year's EmberConf that was great about a deployment strategy, and he had talked to a bunch of the people who maintain different deployment tooling for Ember CLI, and got them all on board with the idea of creating one tool that like summarized all of their knowledge and made it easy to use. And they've done that over this year, and they have like their own kind of structure of a team that maintains this thing and tries to solve the harder problems in it by bouncing ideas around between people who know the domain really well. We're seeing that now with accessibility happening in Ember, where there's another team that's popped up to do that. The translations libraries have worked closely with each other to try and see if there's a path for them to merge. So it's kind of cool from the bottom up to see these people trying to say that they want a single solution. Even the maintainers, they don't want to maintain their own bespoke thing. They want it to move forward.
I think that's a really mature attitude. So one concern that I have with like all the decisions being made for me, and I think this is a pretty common criticism of convention over configuration, is like the times where like this tool was built totally out of the context of my application, so it might not cover my use cases properly, or I might have a weird endpoint that I just have to hit because it's a vendor endpoint or something like that. So how often do you find yourselves having to break outside of these conventions, and how easy is it for you to do that?
Yeah, that's a good question for Gavin. I feel like Robert and I probably have the curse of knowledge on that one.
Right, so I guess, I mean, don't let the idea of convention over configuration scare you or interpret it as meaning that there's only absolutely one way of doing things. So first of all, like Robert touched on, the Ember Deploy team, they coalesce to form, you know, one add-on that does deployment, but internally it's got a plugin strategy. So there's all these different plugins that fit in there. So it's now a convention. It's now a higher level API where people are now contributing all different types of strategies, and there's an ecosystem of solutions emerging there. From the Intercom app perspective, because we're quite a large app, there are many people working on it. So over the last 2 years, we've been working on the our Ember application. We've had to dip into lower level APIs or private APIs from time to time, or even just bypass Ember altogether. I mean, it's JavaScript running in a browser. It's got access to the DOM. It's got jQuery. You can use jQuery plugins. If you want, you can very lightly wrap them with components and reuse them, so you get the benefit of encapsulation and reusability and testing and all of that. We've also noticed that when we do, from time to time, dip down, that's the time when we might have to put in a little bit of work as the framework upgrades, and that's the kind of trade-off you have to make. By bypassing the conventions where necessary, we're not part of this shared understanding of what an Ember application is, so we just need to shepherd that through as the framework progresses. But interestingly, as we dip, as we find small areas or pockets of areas where we have to go lower than what Ember provides, or to bypass the conventions, quite often there's an interesting problem there with some solutions emerge from that. And this is, I'm not sure who it was, but someone tweeted a couple of days ago, a week ago, they said Ember is a community from which a framework emerges. And I just think that's spot on. Quite often when you struggle with a framework or a toolkit or anything like that, especially a framework, if other people are having similar problems, that's just an opportunity for us to get together, figure out what it is actually we're trying to do, build a nice API in an open way with an RFC, and that's how the framework moves along. And in our time with Intercom, we've done that a number of times. We've bypassed one of the conventions. We've created an add-on. We've noticed other people have the same problem. We talk about it, sometimes create an RFC, and then this either makes its way into Ember, or people coalesce and agree upon one particular add-on, and that moves on independently.
Ihani, did you have something?
Yeah. I guess one of the things with Ember, like, so with Angular, I guess you would be able to sprinkle Angular into like your HTML tags to refactor towards like piece by piece. We've seen the same story about like React by going piecemeal on one small component of an application and then building outwards to a larger application. What's the story around refactoring like an existing like server rendered application with just like maybe vanilla JavaScript with some jQuery sprinkled into it to an Ember application, and like is there any conventions around that, or I guess any good resources on learning about that for new Ember developers or just a team that may be looking to use Ember for their product?
Yeah, so there is not, I think there are two strategies. There is not, unfortunately, I can't think of like a single guide or something that summarizes all of the knowledge that exists about this. I think it's characteristically the kind of knowledge that happens internally at companies and that they gain and then they immediately throw away because once they've used it, like they don't.
Yeah.
But the first strategy is to use URLs, which is going to sound low tech, but works really well for a lot of different kinds of applications. You basically are migrating page by page, and then you use URLs to navigate between them, and everything just works like it should because Ember apps have really great, strong support for URL routing. But the second strategy, which is I think more what you're getting to, which is more fun technically, is figuring out how to get an Ember component to drop into part of a page, which is a lot more exciting. There is an add-on called Ember Islands, written by Mitch Lloyd, who I work with, who is a fantastic, really capable developer. Ember Islands lets you, I think it pairs very well with the Rails app, but basically you're able to drop in a payload of data for a component and declare where you want the component to go. And it's a very specific implementation of that solution. I've certainly implemented it, and other people have on top of a different library called Ember Wormhole. And Ember Wormhole works a little bit differently. When Ember renders, when Ember's render tree actually happens, it of course just makes a bunch of DOM nodes. Ember Wormhole uses this magic trick where it says, well, I just rendered a bunch of text nodes or elements into the DOM, so now I'm just going to take them all off the DOM and then put them back on the DOM in a different location that's outside of my app proper, which is kind of a cool magic trick that lets you do lots of really interesting things with an Ember component. So I think there are a couple strategies out there. I just gave a talk at EmberConf on custom elements and how you can consume custom elements from inside of an Ember app and how you might invoke Ember components from a custom element. So I'd like to see us experiment a little bit more with a custom element strategy. But I think at the end of the day, all that stuff is good, but for Ember at least, it's an interim step. And I think that is a slight difference. If you're talking about building an Angular 1 app, certainly, maybe not 2, but a React app, like you really are maybe saying that I'm going to sprinkle this in and that'll be fine. That's my end game, and that's definitely not what we want your end game to be.
So if we go back to back in history a little bit, and I realize half our listeners probably weren't even in our industry 4 years ago, but if we go back a few years ago, we had Backbone was a pretty popular quote-unquote framework. Certainly, a lot of people are inspired by the MVC pattern or MV star pattern to implement on top of that, and I personally was a fan of it because it was very modular. I could sort of pick and choose the different pieces that I liked, and there were certain things that I thought were awful and other things that I thought were great. But the problem with Backbone that I think some of these other newer frameworks have tried to solve is that if you lined up 10 different people that were Backbone developers, you'd get 11 different answers for what a Backbone app is, because it was so wide open. So I think we saw a move to sort of constrain down to do a thing. You just have to understand like this one concept, and this is the flow of the stream. So if you go with the flow of the stream, it works. And so if we think about Angular, that notion is declarative markup, and the idea of how we separate out our controllers. I don't even remember all this terminology. In React, it seems like the virtual DOM, and especially with Redux, like the single flow of data and that sort of thing. So for Ember, what's that like one set of core concepts that I would need to learn so that I could do Ember the idiomatic way, the way that goes with the flow, instead of trying to come up with my own thing from scratch?
Robert is already unmuted, so I'm looking at him.
Yeah. So I mean, so the nice thing about Ember, like a few of us have said, is that we're generally always sort of emerging the way that we look at things, and we we think about problems. We saw React coming forward and doing some really awesome things with the idea of data down, actions up, and not in, and we've absolutely like wholeheartedly glommed onto that and let them do our research for us and learned many things from them, and that's still very much the right way to build an idiomatic Ember 2 app. I think in addition to that, other things that are very important and you should always keep in mind is especially when you're building an app and not just like a widget that's interactive on the page, is that like your app essentially is owning a given URL, and that URL is like the single frame of reference that people are going to jump into your app and link to and jump around, and that thing is like canonical. That is where that's like home base, right? Like that's where your thing lives. That's what's one of the most important parts of the app. And this is also a thing that many apps, hopefully non-Ember apps, actually get wrong. Like how many times have you been on a really nice, slick website and wanted to copy a link and paste it to someone, and the link doesn't actually open to where you were? Like that kind of thing is really annoying, and it basically is breaking the web conceptually. Like the idea of the web is that you can link to things, and Ember works really hard to make that structure very simple from a user perspective to implement and follow. So I guess my answer would be those are the two main sort of guiding principles. Go from the URL forward, structure your app based on how you want to present it, and essentially determine like who owns what data and only allow that thing to mutate the data, basically.
Yeah, I think the direct comparison it's difficult to make the direct comparison to what is the model compared to something like React. Like I think in Robert's answer, what I was hearing a lot is talking about routes. And I think that's the classic thing where, or not classic, but it's rather indicative of the fact that Ember's scope is a little bit larger. So we could talk about what the unifying characteristics of like the templating engine is, but that's not the bounds of like of what we're trying to build for people.
Very cool. I had a question around, I guess, it's a concept I don't want to like go untalked about in the show. So I want to hear more around like the story about server rendered like Ember applications, and talking about Fastboot and perhaps the future of that, if y'all know that, because I think it's really, I know that they announced that at EmberConf. I know that there was a lot of hype around that, but I'm wondering how far along maybe progress is around like having a Fastboot application that also will be able to like maybe do the initial boot, but then rehydrate your app so you can then continue using it.
Okay, so I will start from the beginning of time, or of Fastboot.
All right.
And so Ember CLI Fastboot is a library that you can install in an Ember app today. It currently works with stable versions of Ember, so you can kind of just drop it in and use it, and it renders. And it works actually really well. There are a number of things that you'll end up fighting or dealing with various parts of your app and your and any external libraries you pull in, things that might assume things about the state, like assume that they have document or assume that they have window, which aren't actually things in the server. So you'll have to figure those things out. But basically, the entire Ember community is also going through this path with you, and you'll find, or at least I have found, as I've built these sites, other people are also discovering things, and we chat. There's a nice Slack room where we talk about it, and people are fixing other add-ons that they don't own, and going through and just dealing with all those things. So that's the first part, and that very much works today. It's still, I would call it more like beta-ish, right? Like, it's not perfect. There's a lot of things in the ecosystem, like other add-ons that you might pull in, that need some assistance. Some things are actually really complicated in the server rendered page. So things like auth, right? Like, how do you track auth? How do you do, like, in-app, in a browser, it's very well-known thing, and in the server, it's a very well-known thing. But how do you go between the two, right? How do you bridge the gap with the same library? Those kinds of things are the things that are currently actively being solved. There is a specific team within the Ember Sphere, the Fastboot team. They have regular meetings. I think their meeting minutes are actually published as well.
They're actually having a meeting right now.
Right now, yes. So that's sort of the first few bits. The last part, and this is the tricky part, or as if the rest of it hasn't been tricky so far, is actually rehydrating the app. So when you get the HTML like emitted from the server, and you get the browser request HTML, how do you resume that app with the current state? And that part's not done. So right now, what happens is essentially we just re-render the DOM, like everything. Like clearing what was there previously, and the path forward on that is the implementation of the newer rendering engine that we're actively pushing very hard on. It's both faster in most every way, and also will give us the ability to start working on the rehydration stuff. So that's kind of where things are at. Server rendering right now absolutely works. You can use it to, for example, run an Ember app without JavaScript enabled, for example, or potentially serve to older clients or whatever. SEO is a great other use case. But then once it boots, it's still going to sort of clear that server rendered DOM and re-render from scratch. But we're actively working on it. We have a plan forward. I don't give timelines for open source projects, but it's definitely a thing that's very high on our priority list.
For sure. So after it, with this Fastboot story, that means that you would probably move away from rendering your Ember application within the context of your backend, within the context of a Rails application. You can move it to its own separate server to actually have that true separation of the front end application from the back end that could just now be your API service.
Yeah. So right now, a lot of people confuse or get confused in general when we talk about server rendered. We are not saying that your API server is the thing rendering your HTML. Yeah. Right. What we're saying is you're actually using the same Ember app that boots in the browser. You're going to use that and spin up a Node instance or Node process, whatever, and render the HTML in Node land with the same exact code that runs in the browser. So that means that it's going to be on the server side communicating with whatever other outside processes have your API, or all of that stays exactly the same. And the nice side effect is, even if you didn't want to do the rehydration stuff, or you didn't want to send the HTML to the client, you now have ways to, for example, discover what all the data for a given page load is going to be, and preload that for them, right? Like, those kinds of things are possible even without caring about the pre-rendered HTML.
Yeah, which is actually what LinkedIn is doing for their mobile page now. They code to figure out what API calls happen.
Chad Hightail gave a great talk about that idea and concept at EmberConf as well. I can link that in the show notes.
Yeah, that'd be great. Awesome. Thanks. So I want to ask about some of the challenges of rehydration, because it's not an easy problem. So some of the things that I can think of is maintaining focus. So in the time that the user gets the HTML, and then they can start messing around with the app, and if they have a slow network, it takes a while to get all the JavaScript down and then rehydrate. like they can tab into different input elements, and if you totally re-render, then they lose focus. Another thing would be like, I know that Angular Universal, I believe that they have this ability to like track the things that the user is clicking on and interacting with, and then replay those events when the JavaScript loads and things are rehydrated. So what are some of are you addressing those issues, and then what are some of the other challenges that rehydration brings up?
Yeah, I mean,
and to piggyback on that for just a moment, can we actually define what rehydration is? We threw that term around, and I'm not sure that everybody listening will even know what that means.
Yeah, I'm happy to define it, and then I'll kick it back over to Matt. So basically, rehydration, when you talk about sending a string of HTML to a browser, that HTML obviously already has the content in it, like maybe whatever dynamic data that was pre-rendered, like a person's name or the blog post title or whatever the heck it is, will be pre-rendered in the DOM elements, right? Like so in like divs or whatever the heck you're using. And so rehydration would is basically talking about so from the perspective of the JavaScript app that's going to boot after that has already been rendered and shown to the user, how do you take that state that's already embedded in the DOM and seed that state into the running booted JavaScript app, right? The same problems exist in basically anyone that's doing server-side rendering. Like you have to figure out how to get the state that's already been encoded into the DOM back into the running app, so you don't have to do things like delete all the DOM elements and re-render from scratch, right? So that's rehydration in a nutshell. Is that process of taking the data or the current state essentially from the DOM and hydrating the booted Ember app state or the current app state.
Yeah, and it is a subtle thing that I know I've seen frameworks like Riot being used in the wild where they don't actually do rehydration. People presume that virtual DOM means it will rehydrate, and that's not necessarily always true. Yeah, to speak to Kent's point, I think like the replay of events you basically described exactly what we would want to undertake. We would do something very similar to what Angular 2 is doing, where we just keep a queue of all the things that the user is interacting with, and then attempt to play those back. Obviously, that's going to take a bunch of real-world testing to see how that goes. An important goal here, though, is that if you want to do a server-rendered React app, that's like definitely totally possible today, and you can do it really well. One of the challenges, though, is that a large part of your server will be very bespoke, and a large part of your architecture will be very unique to what you're doing. And with Ember's Fastboot strategy, we do want a strategy that's easy enough and simple enough that everyone has no excuse. Like, if you don't want to do it, of course you can opt out. But like today with Fastboot, you can deploy a build pack to Heroku and boot up your Ember app on Heroku and be done. Like it should be like a 3-step process. It should not be sending a rocket to the moon in order to run your client-side app on the server. To the second part about some of the challenges in like mutating focus and kind of changing the DOM as you render. So the Glimmer 2 work that we've been doing in Ember is learning a lot from the previous passes that we've done on rendering engines of HTML bars and Glimmer, and like every time we learn something new and move forward a little bit. Glimmer 2 has a really interesting architecture. When it ships down templates to your client, it ships down a series of opcodes that run on a virtual machine in your browser. And as we execute those opcodes, we build up the DOM for your screen, but at the same time, we're emitting a different set of update opcodes. So if we need to re-render that logic, we don't actually run the initial opcodes all over again because there's a bunch of wasted work that we don't need anymore. All we do is run the updated opcodes. So the key for us to do rehydration and do it really well is that when we, on the server, render your application in Fastboot, we keep track of those update opcodes on the server side, and then we just ship all those opcodes down to the client. So we don't even need to like walk the DOM to check that everything is correct. I mean, barring browser quirks, which may or may not come into play. Like we just ship the update opcodes, and then we're done. Like you don't need to go and change the input to be some kind of new input or something like that. Everything just stays the DOM that it was. If you want to learn more detail about like how the opcodes in Glimmer 2 work, it's a fascinating architecture. Yehuda has a different talk. Yehuda and Godfrey Chan have a different talk from EmberConf this year, a few weeks ago, where they go into some detail. And then Gavin Joyce actually has an excellent interview that he did with Yehuda like a month and a half or 2 months ago that goes through the architecture in a lot of really deep detail with a lot of code up on the screen.
In the React world, one of the things that is touted is the integration with React Native, that you learn one set of coding practices and now you can switch over and work in the native world. Can you speak to what strategy you would use if you were kind of all in on the Ember side of things and you had an app that was running on a server and then you wanted to start trying to use that same code and target a native client, for example?
Yeah, I think the native strategy is an interesting thing to bring up and talk about. Technically, this is totally plausible. Like, this is definitely a thing that we can do. The Glimmer 2 architecture is basically completely isolated, similar to Angular 2, where they talked a lot about how their rendering engine is completely isolated from the DOM itself, so they could, for instance, do rendering on a web worker, then ship the extra work back over to the main thread so that you're not blocking the UI thread when you're rendering. Glimmer 2 has a lot of similar facets. So that, I think technically it's very, very plausible, and I know I have personally discussed it with a couple of people, the idea of what an Ember native would look like. I think the bigger fight, though, is that we're trying to take the fight to native apps themselves. We think that the web is a viable platform for you to publish what people consider app-like experiences today. And that's really the end goal for us. Like the end goal as a framework, as someone who like maintains the framework and tries to think about where we're going and what we want to do with it, is that like we are in the position of privilege where we get to make the web what we want it to be. Like JavaScript is really powerful, and we want the web to be a viable platform for those things. We don't want to have you go in and download a 30 megabyte, 40 megabyte app in order to see your Pinterest page. Like, this is a joke. This is not what we want to be doing in 5 years or 10 years. And so the fight really is not about how can we use web developer expertise on native things. I understand that's a big priority for Facebook. That's a big priority for Google, where they have like that kind of transfer of knowledge that they want to happen on their very large teams. And I don't think that Ember, like as a community, is against that. I just think as a framework, our reason d'etre is to focus on the web and to make the web great. And so I'd like to make make great mobile apps possible is like the real goal, which slightly directs away from your question, which isn't the intent.
Yeah, so you're kind of focused more on the progressive web app story, making the actual web application feel native, but actually be just a web app.
Yeah, this was a big focus at EmberConf, and is something that as a framework we've been work into Fastboot, and we've been pouring a lot of work into Glimmer 2, and we've been pouring a lot of work into JSON API, which is a great abstraction for being able to get like cacheable entities that actually guarantee that you have all the data about the data model when you go to the client side and things like that. So all those things are, the cool thing about Ember is kind of like with Ember CLI, it was a big mess for a long time. It didn't look a lot better than what anyone else was doing, but we managed to like piece together and create mature solutions, even though they took longer, and then suddenly we have Ember CLI, and it's great. And it didn't come out of nowhere. It was a lot of like directed work that we knew there was an end goal we wanted to get to. I think like a big goal this year, this summer, this fall is going to be mobile apps and that progressive web app experience, and we have that end goal. It's just like we need to take the directed steps to get toward it.
Tom and Yehuda's keynote from EmberConf about 3 weeks ago is a good summary of a lot of that, I think.
Yeah, I
cool.
think
Yeah,
let's make the term SDK for the web, which I think is a great one.
Cool. Yeah, let's make sure we get that link in the show notes, please, Gavin. Thank you.
So my last question, just to kind of bring this all full circle, is I'm excited by the cool stuff that it sounds like Ember is working on. There's a lot of really interesting problems that the community seems to be tackling, and that's awesome. I think one of the things that we've seen from, for example, the Angular world was that Angular 1 came out and everybody got super excited and jumped on Angular 1 and they built all of their apps in it, and then Angular 2 came out and the world looked a whole lot different and there's a lot of pain. So my question, and I don't mean this to sound snarky, but my question is, is it maybe too early to jump on the Ember train if there's all this amazing stuff that's coming out and still being developed? Like, for example, maturity around Fastboot, the stuff with Glimmer 2 sounds mind-blowing. Are we too early to jump on that? And what I mean by that is if we build an Ember app the way it is now, how locked in are we to that where things could be very different 6 months or 12 months from now, similar to what we saw in the Angular world?
Yeah, I'll just say one or two things. I think this is a topic that's near and dear to Ember as a framework, so I can communicate. And I think both Gavin and Robert will probably have pretty interesting things to say. So I'll try and keep mine short. But one of the things you get by buying into Ember as a framework that is truly independent is that you have the ability to influence what happens to it. Like, we are not something that we are not working on an internal product that's, you know, the ads platform at Google internally, and that's our main use case I'm thinking of, which is not meant to be a slight against the Angular team, who takes many use cases into account. But it is actually our bread and butter as our framework. We all, like, I work for a small consumption company that's worked with a bunch of various companies. Robert works at an Amazon-owned like bigger company. Gavin works at like a medium-sized startup, and we're all here talking about being experts in this framework because even though we all have very, very different use cases and desires in the day-to-day. So I think we keep that close to our minds, and by participating in the Ember community, you have the ability to continue to shape that direction. A year ago, there weren't so many people who worked on Ember at huge companies, and this year we have like PlayStation Now, and Yahoo is a really big buy-in, and LinkedIn is a really big buy-in, and all these big companies making big bets. And you can see in the framework how that shifted our focus. So I think when you participate in open source, you are able to decide what happens. If you're just consuming something blindly, then you don't have that opportunity. So I think there's always change. Ember has a value of stability without stagnation, that we focus on semantic versioning, having smooth upgrades to major versions where there are no actual breaking changes. We just remove features. And I think that will continue because our focus is on real applications from people in the wild. But Robert or Gavin, please.
Yeah, I think the key is the stability without stagnation idea, and there was a great talk that you had just gave that sort of went through the progression of that, and I think that the idea that if you wrote an Ember, an idiomatic Ember 1.5 app or something, this was a long time ago. I can't even, like a year and a half ago or something. You could relatively straightforwardly get that app up to date with current version of Ember, which is 2.5. And most of that is with the tooling and the workflow processes that we've put together to help you figure out. We don't remove things without deprecations, even private APIs. Like the things like that, right? So if you can jump up, you see the deprecation, you read the docs. The deprecations all have URL links to tell you what to do. All of that stuff is exactly what where we're going. We've just recently released our first LTS, which is if you're not familiar, Ember itself has like a train model similar conceptually to what Chrome has done. So we ship a new version, a new minor release every 6 weeks. If that's a little too fast for you, or you don't want to try to do that work each time, if there is any work, you can always just stick on the LTS, and those are roughly 4 months, I believe. And the idea is that the deprecations and whatnot will always be a good landing point at the various LTSs, so you can see things. You know what the path forward is and whatnot. So I think, unlike with, especially initially with the Angular 2 announcement, like they didn't necessarily have an upgrade plan. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to build the best framework they could build, and I think that's great, actually. And I think that, but I think it's a little bit reversed for us. Like, our goal is to build the best framework we can, but make sure all of our users can get there. And at every step of the way, we're always planning migrations. We're planning, the stepping stones to get to where we want to be. And in the end, it's just the long game, right? Like, it's, you take the right angles, you do the right things along and along. And since Ember is really, as Gavin said earlier, it's really a community. Like, leaving people behind just because an individual company or what a core stakeholder needs a given thing or needs to change the path isn't an option, right? Like, because we're all made up of many different companies, many different users, and the whole community itself sort of drives the direction of where things are going.
I think you'll see with Glimmer 2 when there'll be some point release later in the year, and Glimmer 2 will be enabled for everyone, and it will be an easy upgrade because it's compatible with the handlebars template syntax, and all of the helpers that go along with it, and all of the hooks into Ember will work the same way. So it's by design. It will just happen. Your app will magically become faster, leaner. And that's certainly been our experience. Even going from 1 to 2, which obviously frameworks learn. You release a 1, you do all sorts of things. You learn from the community. People start using it. The 1 to 2 transition hasn't been painless, and a lot of lessons have been learned, but it hasn't been very painful. And I looked at what happened when Angular 2 was announced, and I just for a moment thought of what that would have meant for us at Intercom in terms of just even dollars, if that had happened if that had been Ember's approach to upgrading, and it just would have been. I would have felt embarrassed. I was so thankful, like that. These are some of the things that the reasons that I was able to convince people in Intercom that we should make a big bet on Ember, and I'm so happy to see that actually it's all unfurled exactly like that, and it remains a big part of what Ember is.
Awesome, thank you for that. We are really down on our time, so we do have 2 questions on Twitter. If you do have a question, if you're watching live, you can tweet JSR question, and we'll look at those. So the first is from Scott Chapman. And this one, I think the answer will be anecdotal at best, but might be interesting. The question is, how do Ember dev salaries compare to other front-end dev salaries? Definitely an interesting question.
Yeah, I'm not competitive. I mean, devs get paid pretty well a lot of places. I know that San Francisco pays better than New York. I know that London is more expensive but doesn't pay as good as San Francisco. But I've never quite heard anyone say that they got paid more for working in React versus working in Angular, or Vue.js versus Ember or something like that. So I know there is certainly a lot of demand.
Yeah, cool. we have people. We have engineers working on React and Intercom. We have engineers who work with Backbone, and we have engineers who work on Ember, and we're all treated the same in many ways.
That's probably good. Awesome. And for our last question, this is from Eric Henchett, and the question is, are there some features not in Ember you'd like to see added from other frameworks like React or Angular?
I can definitely state at least one. So Angular, I'm not sure that I agree totally with the API, but Angular's their new template syntax in 2.0 allows you to, in a way that not even React allows you to do, it allows you to say exactly that you want to set a property or an attribute or add an event handler to a DOM node. And I don't like their micro syntax. I think it's too micro-syntaxy and too magical. If you learn it, it's great, but if you're picking it up and walking into a project, there's no way you know what bracket parentheses, something parentheses bracket means. But I think that would be a great thing for Ember to be able to do better at, especially, like I said, I've been looking at web components, custom elements a lot, and in order to interact with those, we need a better way to decide exactly what I want to do. I want to set an attribute. I want to add an easy event listener. There's an RFC for element modifiers, which is something I was working on a few months ago that I'm going to be pushing on again, and element modifiers would probably help with that solution.
I think what I'd like to see in Ember personally, or at least Ember CLI, is first-class support for importing from NPM modules and not having to use something third-party like Ember Browserify because I guess at a previous employer I was using React with Webpack, and it was nice being to import npm modules. But now, right now as it is, Ember doesn't have first-class support for that. You can use Bower libraries, but it'd still be nice to have like npm, because there are a lot of libraries that are on npm that aren't necessarily on Bower. So yeah, that's my one wish.
Yeah, the good thing is that we're actively pushing towards that. We use some of our Bower dependencies from around 15, maybe 6 down to I think 4 right now, and they're slowly pushing towards that future. Once we've dropped the requirement of Bower for new apps, then we'll be able to begin working on, but like out of the box, making the require from npm packages work. In many add-ons today, for example, will take a a known library, like there's a great fetch polyfill, right? There's an add-on that takes the fetch polyfill and makes it and wraps it and augments it and adds nice utility functions to use in Ember and whatnot, and that all comes from npm. So it's definitely possible. It's just a lot more annoying than it needs to be, and so I think that it's definitely the path forward. I guess I'll go since I'm already talking. So I'd really like to see us to continue to push the barriers of developer ergonomics and making things better. And I think that this will actually help the entire ecosystem. Ember CLI is just Ember CLI, so as we make improvements and extractions and make the world better there, at least both frameworks get better, and likely many others. So the things to me are just from a developer perspective, like what are the hitches? What are the places where the gotchas and the things that you trip up? And I'm not sure that every framework has them. So I'm not sure that I'm stealing this idea from another framework. So probably not answering the question properly. But that's one of the biggest things that I'd like to see fixed.
Cool. We just got another question. So this is from K2G, and the question is, Ember is not typically a framework of choice in Java-based shops. Do you see that as well in consulting projects? And maybe is there a reason for that?
So I know of a number of fairly large shops using Java on the back end and Ember apps on the front end. I'm not sure. I think the idea. There's integration points that could still be made better and whatnot, but there's nothing inherently different about Angular in the concept of what your backend is written in. So I don't think there's any barrier. It just may not be like a mindset thing, like where the people are more exposed to a given platform or another.
Yeah, I think even in the world of Ruby, where I think that's the most immediate, what people most immediately correlate with Ember. But Ember has nothing, just because it's like Ruby, it's more like the lessons of Ruby and Rails that we take away. It is none of the actual technology or stack. You don't use the Rails command anymore or anything like that to do anything with Ember. And I think that's maybe part of the jump as well. People are very used to putting JavaScript into their existing server-side stack code base. And it's a little bit of a conceptual leap to jump away from that, especially if you have a Java code base that's probably quite large if you're at an enterprise shop. But we work with Ember apps that use Go on the back end, that use Ruby on the back end, that use Python on the back end, is all kinds of things.
Yeah, I think you have that conceptual jump with any modern framework where we changed from server-side render totally to client-side render. Now we're kind of doing both, and people are still banging away at the server-side only stuff. So we're all learning and growing. So that's our question. So it's time to get into our tips and picks. So we'll go with our panelists, and then I'll go, and then we'll have our guests go. Let's see. Ihani, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I guess just for my picks, I have a link to a series for building a performant real-time web app with Ember Fastboot and Phoenix. And it's by Mike North. And I think I haven't gone through it yet, but I was just browsing through it, scrolling through it, and it looks very interesting. It's cool like to see how the story around using Ember Fastboot and combine that with another new technology, or at least one that's getting really popular, like Phoenix and Elixir. So I thought it looked pretty cool. I'd suggest people check it out. It looks like a good resource for learning both Fastboot and Ember, and use them together. I mean Ember and Phoenix.
Cool. Good.
Yeah, so just picks today. Right now there's quite a bit of discussion that sparked up over the last 24 to 48 hours over ES6 modules and how they fit into the Node and CommonJS ecosystem. Bradley Meck and several other people have been doing a lot of work on that, and they came out with a draft proposal for what they think it should be, and it involves having to name our files with a different file extension, and then a bunch of other people jumped up and said, oh, that's terrible. So there's actually at least one counter proposal that's been put out. So there's a good raging debate on that, and regardless of where you sit, I think it would be good for listeners to kind of pay closer attention to that stuff, because it's definitely going, whatever decision gets made is going to be with us for a really long time in the Node ecosystem. Two very self-serving picks. First mention is Front-End Masters. Front-End Masters, for those of you who don't know, is a great video training platform. I have a bunch of my trainings on there, as well as there's 30 some odd other 30 or 40 other authors that have done amazing courses on there. So I highly recommend checking out Front-End Masters. You've probably seen some of those videos get serialized out into places like Pluralsight and so forth, but Front-End Masters is the main platform for that, so I recommend that for sure. And the other self-serving link is the book series that I have, the You Don't Know JS books. It has been asked for more than 3 years now for there to be some box set sort of pricing for people that want to buy more than one of the books in the series. That's finally out. We have discounts for purchasing 2 or more of the copies, or a flat price for all 6 books, and that applies to both print and ebook. So I'm excited to see that come out, and on the heels of that, as soon as we release that pricing now, I'm going to be starting up on the 2nd edition revisions pretty soon. So that's my picks.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. That's really interesting about that modules thing. People definitely check that out, because this will be very impactful on your lives. Okay, so I'll go ahead and give my tips and picks. My tip for this week is thank at least one person every day out of the blue. So I got an email a week or two ago from somebody just saying thank you, and it was just super nice. It totally was validating and just made my day. And then today, here's my pick. I got a tweet from David Wells. He just published a blog post entitled JavaScript Community Thank You Letter, which was just super, super nice of him, where he's thanking several people in the community that's helped him out. And so, yeah, thank people, and they will be happy. Also, teledoc. So I am sick right now and not feeling super well, and the last thing that you want to do when you're sick is leave the house, and so like even to go to the doctor. And so for the first time ever, I tried this teledoc thing, and I was able to like just do the appointment on my phone and get a prescription, and it was awesome. So yeah, 2016 is a great time to be alive. So yeah, those are my picks. Gavin, why don't we have you go next?
Okay, so my tip is I've come across this saying a few times. I believe it's from Steve Jobs. Normally it's on a poster on a wall in some software shop, and it's not done until it ships. And I think that was it was true back in the day when shipping software or hardware. Software meant putting bits on a CD and putting it in a box and putting it in a shop to sell. That was done back in those days, but I think we can do better. I think shipping is just the beginning is a better thing to put on a poster, and I encourage people to do that. So for my pick, it's a musical instrument called Ableton Push, something I've been playing around with and thinking about a little bit recently. I'm planning to do a series of YouTube videos on, I just did the first this week, on using JavaScript to control it. And I'm hoping that this ends up with actually building a runtime in Ember for the Ableton Push, and hopefully get to present that at maybe Ember Fest in October. If well, I'm going to submit the talk, and if it gets accepted, to end up there and possibly with a live performance.
That's sweet. You should add a link to your YouTube series that you were talking about. That'd be sweet. Matthew, we'll have you go next.
Yeah, I didn't think I had anything, and then all you guys had great stuff, and now I have stuff. I wanted to quickly add to Gavin's thing. The Yehuda during the keynote, he said it really, really fast, so I think a lot of people didn't hear it at EmberConf, but Ember has a 6-week release cycle, which is akin to browsers. But when we did the 1.0 to 2.0 jump, it's kind of like the first time you've had a 6-week release cycle based thing, but then also had a breaking change as part of it. And I think that's part of the big opportunity for lessons, was like it was kind of a unique event, and we hope that other libraries pick it up and we can all learn more. I guess I'll do my tips first. Quick tip for code review. I think you should always assign code review to someone. Don't just open a PR and let it go into the void. Someone's name on it and make them responsible for it so that they need to follow through, and you can ping them and nudge them if you need to. Avoid using pronouns and don't use words like you or we and things like that. Try and focus on the code and talk about the ways that you would differently structure the problem instead. I think for some picks, I use a cool tool called Teammate sometimes, which is kind of like TeamMux, which is a terminal multiplexer, but Teammate lets you share the session over SSH, which is great for remote pair programming when you don't have great video and you can just use audio, and then you can use share the terminal. It's also really good for doing training because you can share read-only sessions where people can everyone in the room can see what's going on your terminal without needing to look at a projector or something like that. There's a conference called Wicked Good Ember that a consulting company in Boston, Dockyard, runs that's coming up this summer. It happens on Thompson Island, so it's really fun. It's in Boston, and it was a great event last year, and I think it'll be really fun this year, so you should check that out. And last pick would be if you're interested in Ember and you think some of the things we talked about are neat, you should find Alex Machinier's talk on Ember concurrency. Push that hype. Ember concurrency is basically, Alex kept coming to the core team and saying, like, look at RX, look at observables, and we should put this stuff into Ember, and he got heavy pushback on nobody thinking that the API was something that people actually really master and really take home. It's a very intimidating thing to learn observables, and you kind of need to wrap your brain around them first. If you're talking about I have a team of developers and I just want to manage my async properly, it's overwhelming to ask them to learn observables just to do that. So he nailed a beautiful API that uses ES5 generator syntax to be able to just naturally write code that feels good, but also handles async in a way similar to observables. So I highly encourage that you check out Ember concurrency.
Cool, thank you. And Robert.
All right, so tips. So basically, the first tip dovetails. I thought Matt was going to steal my tip actually, but it dovetails nicely with Matt's tip, and of always assigning code review to someone. My tip is always automate the menial tasks. So essentially, in Ember, we do release cycle. We do individual beta releases every week, many for both Ember and Ember CLI and Ember Data and all the projects. It's a lot of work that's happening every week. You absolutely have to automate as much as possible in those cases. The same is true in your company, though. It's not just an open source project thing. Like the same is true at every job you have. There are tasks that you do. Sometimes it's like deploying to master, or deploying after master merges, or something like that, right? All of that stuff should be automated. Like, free yourself from doing that sort of routine manual labor, and buy yourself time on the things that are actually you're getting paid to do, and hopefully, and and move those things forward. So that's like my tip. My picks are going to be weird. The first pick, and I don't know how you pick this, but I'm going to pick it, is the April update for Destiny. Destiny is a video game I play on PS4. It is awesome. I am assigned the duty of playing video games as a chore to not do too much open source, and this update was the best update that they've done to the game. It's been really great, and it's been so much fun. So the second pick is don't work too much, or yeah, basically it dovetails with the first one. And then the last one is always get involved in the community that you're working in. Don't just assume that it's this faceless walled garden of software development and letting everything happen sort of over there and not being involved. Get involved. Jump in. Like Ember has a great Slack room. There's a few thousand people in there, and like you can ask questions. There's help channels. There's channels specifically for all sorts of things. Every community has this, and you're going to get way more out of any framework or language or anything you're doing if you can jump in and actually talk to people and meet that community that we've talked so much about. So that's me.
Awesome, thank you. So I think we're going to wrap things up. And so just to give a quick shout out to our silver sponsors, they are O'Reilly, FluentConf, Auth0, and Trading Technologies. Check them all out because they're awesome and support the show. Thank you to them. If you have suggestions on future shows or topics, go to suggest.javascriptair.com. We appreciate your suggestions. And if you have feedback for this show or other shows, go to feedback.javascriptair.com, and I will personally read all of those. And then we have a newsletter for each show. We give some highlights from the show and post in the show notes and stuff. So go to jsair.io/email to see previous newsletters and to sign up for the newsletter in your inbox. And then remember, next week we're going to be on site at ngconf, so the time will be different. So just be aware of that, live viewers. And we're going to have a bunch of people. It's going to be fun. And yeah, as always, follow us on Twitter, Google+, and Facebook to keep up with the latest. And that's it. So thanks, everyone, for showing up. And I think this was a really great show. So thanks. And we'll catch you all next week.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.